It's called the market revolution because it relates to basically the economic revolution, transformation of America, which draws more people into a market economy. Agriculture, for example, the idea of a lot of people would grow stuff. Obviously, wealthy planters in the South who had large plantations, you were growing some sort of crop to sell, to make money off of, right? But then there's also what is called subsistence farming. Does anyone know the difference between growing a cash crop and being a subsistence farmer? But yeah, you grow you don't just grow one thing necessarily each season. You grow a variety of crops that you live off of. You maybe have pigs or livestock that you use for dairy, chickens you basically are living off of what you are producing on your farm. And a lot of Americans were in that situation in the 1700s because there was no way to get necessarily if they grew a crop unless you got a piece of land that was near a waterway, like a river, where you could transport it. You weren't necessarily growing anything for a market economy to sell. Because it's very difficult. A lot of people think that crossing the Atlantic from Europe to the Americas was this big, daunting task. Really, the Atlantic Ocean became this highway of trade. Once you get here, to get from New York to San Francisco, to get across the actual landmass of this continent is very difficult. It's much more difficult than traveling by water. This is a transportation, the rates of travel, how long it took to get across America in 1800 and 1857. So 1800, this is let's go by the lifespan of Abraham Lincoln. He was born in 1809. So this is a few years before he was born. And he lived in Illinois, right? He was a lawyer in Springfield, Illinois, which is about here. So how long does it take to get in 1800, right before he was born, how long does it take to get from New York to basically the end right here? What is this, like 5-6 weeks?
Zach can't come to the phone right now. He's on his way to pick up his season tickets to detention. If you'd like to leave a message, please wait for the beep.
You're talking about if you're traveling by a wagon that's being drawn by some sort of draft animal or on horse, you're talking about the Appalachian Mountains, and different types of terrain. It's very, it's hard. It's very hard. Who played Oregon Trail, right? So it would actually have been when he was born, around the time he was born, he actually ends up living in New Orleans for a while. It would be easier to go down the Mississippi River and then go around the coast to get to Washington, D.C. or New York or someplace like that than to go overland. It would have taken forever. So unless you and most of this country expands and really is tied together currently east to west. And there are no real major rivers necessarily that go east to west. The Mississippi is north-south. The Missouri is north-south. And so it's very hard to travel across the land. So when Lincoln's elected, or when Lincoln's born, Abraham Lincoln's born in 1809. It takes 6 weeks to get from where he lives to the capital, Washington, D.C., 5 to 6 weeks. When he's elected president in 1860, 2 days. 2 days, right? 6 weeks to get to, remember, in 1800, it took 6 weeks to get to where Lincoln lived. And right before he's elected, 60 years later, it takes 2 days. That's because of railroads. Railroads cut across east and west, right? Railroads manipulate our ability as people, as humans, to cross long distances, to close the gap between us, right? Railroads are really what built this country. Railroads are really what built a lot of the cities in this country, like Chicago, right? Because early on, if some of you might be familiar with St. Louis. It has that giant arch. It's seen as the gateway to the west. And it's because it's located on the Mississippi River, right? St. Louis is near that Cahokia, that Indian nation, the city that was part of indigenous, that had a very large population, because the Mississippi River is a natural place where people would live, because it's near a waterway. So water is what we need to live. Water is a good way to travel, right? Places along the river become sites for commerce. Railroads are very important. And the first railroad, let's go back. First railroad we get in 1830. I believe that's the year it's completed. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, right? That's the first railroad. But you're going to end up with a massive amount of railroads going across this country, mostly in the north. This market revolution, fueled by the catalyst, what you'd say the catalyst for it, right? Like like something that triggers it or helps to spur it into action. The catalyst for the market revolution, innovation in transportation and communication, right? When you tie people into a marketplace, or when even the idea of national identity, of who we are, of people seeing themselves from different states, from different regions as American, and people being pulled into this sort of economy where they're expected to now grow stuff that they're going to transport to a marketplace on a railroad and sell it somewhere. Because I mean, before that, if you were growing, some people might have grown some like corn, and maybe they were going to sell some of it. But if they were so far away from a river that they couldn't get to a nearby town where they could sell it, they would usually end up distilling a lot of it, making it into whiskey, distilling it, right? And so you'd have all these small, because it wouldn't spoil that way. You could barrel it and you could use it for other things. But now they're expected to people are expected to grow crops, and they're being pulled into this marketplace. New cities are gonna grow out of nowhere. Like that are basically what you would call factory towns. Not factories like if you look at like NUMMI over in Fremont, or like Detroit, like the auto industry. Not like our modern sense of factory, but early sort of industrialization, where there were a larger number of employees working. Sometimes they were working, a lot of it was in textiles, clothing, and they were working maybe from home, but they were getting materials from some company and sewing them together at home. But there was also some large, factory, some building where a bunch of people were working under the same roof, right? Instead of an artisan, an economy where you have small farms and artisans. So like a good example I use a lot is a shoemaker, a boot maker. You would go into a local shop, right, and say, oh, I need a new pair of boots, and they'd say, okay, I can make you a new pair in 3 days. Come back in 3 days, right? The transition from that sort of world into one where there are 100 people sitting in a room, and you put the sole of the shoe on, and you put the laces in, and all that stuff, and then other people sew this part of the shoe, and everyone performs a specific task. Kind of the precursor to the assembly line. It's not the assembly line where it's not mechanized, but it's basically taking parts of a shoe or whatever, a product, and everybody performs a specific task. It's called the American system of manufacturing. There are two American systems in this to learn about in this time period. One of them is the American system of manufacturing, which relates to the actual production of products. And then there's another American system that relates to government spending and stuff. The American system of manufacturing. So it takes a situation, so in some ways, this is people are being pulled into a marketplace. Some of these factories are going to employ women, but there are instances where factories hire women, and they work in these textile mills and different things. So they're actually earning their own income for the first time. So on some level, it creates opportunities for people. But at the same time, you also have a situation where now goods are being produced for a market economy. They're being mass produced, or the early stages of mass production, right? Where you have, instead of having the boot maker, the shoemaker, who makes the whole shoe, who's a craftsman, right? Who knows how to make the whole shoe. Now a factory is churning out a bunch of shoes where you sew this part and I make this little part and this person makes that part. And it doesn't require as much skill. So even though there are more people, there are all these people employed in the process of producing shoes for a company, none of them are considered skilled workers, and so they're not getting paid as much, right? Whereas the artisan controlled the shop, he controlled his own tools, and had an apprentice or something who would, stuff like that, right? Where now you're going into a building, the idea of punching in and punching out and working for somebody else, the idea of people monitoring your work performance, all of these things, the idea of a clock, the idea of an actual clock, like what we have on every wall in every classroom, and you have it, if you go to work, you see a clock, and that clock being the actual concept of time changes, right? Because now your time belongs to somebody else. And also because railroads and other forms of transportation close the distance between us. The railroads are the corporations are the ones who invent the time zone in 1883, the different time zones. Because before railroads, when it takes 6 weeks to get from Chicago to New York, you don't need time zones. There's no jet lag, right? There's no time adjustment because it takes 6 weeks. You have to be able to, once you start getting from here to here in less than a day, if you say, oh, we're going to grandma's, we're going to get in the wagon, it's going to take 3 days. You don't get there and have to adjust to the new time because you've been traveling like overland very slowly. And so it hasn't been an issue. It's once you can get there in a day. Now it's like, oh, this is a whole new place and different time. And so the railroads actually invented the different time zones in 1883, and they were adopted by the United States government in World War I, when the United States government takes over control of railroads for a while for the war. So, and also as they're building railroad, all these different tracks of railroad across the country, as the railroads expand, next to them they're building telegraph lines. In 1844, there's a telegraph line between Baltimore and Washington, D.C. And so as the railroads are being built, which are tying people together, making the distance between us less, right? The ability to pull everybody into a sort of a more market economy, and also just that whole idea. Telegraph lines are closing the distance for communication, creating some sort of national identity of people identifying as American as part of one place when they're from very different places. Think about that distance. Think about that distance 6 weeks from New York to Chicago, right? Imagine in 2001 when the World Trade Center collapses, right? The two buildings collapse. Imagine if there was no television, there was no radio, there was no internet, and you're living in Chicago and you find out about this event, this terrorist attack, 6 weeks later through word of mouth. It just sort of gets to your region. Oh, did you hear about this thing that happened in New York? There's no pictures of it, It would be very difficult to have the sort of reaction that people, where there's all the candlelight vigils around America, or people who are we are all the whole idea of we are all New Yorkers, or Boston Strong when Boston was hit, that Boston Marathon was that bombing happened. The whole idea of like we are all New Yorkers, identifying with them as Americans of what's happening, all the different like benefit shows and all the stuff people did like within days of that, right, would not have happened. The news is going to change, right? You're going to have the ability now, if something happens in St. Louis or Chicago, they know about it in New York that day, and it's in the newspaper the very next day. So it really helps to tie people together physically, but also ties people together as far as like how they identify, ties people together to this marketplace. If you look at a map of railroad track in this country in 1860, you'll notice it's very clearly there's a lot of it in the north, and there's not a lot in the south. Because even though the South, these two regions are very much connected to this market revolution, because the early industrial period of America, this period, the early factories you're seeing, the different types of corporations that are hiring people like for wages to come in and work in these factories, centers around textile production. It's fabric, right? It's cloth, which is made with cotton, right? Cotton is grown where? On plantations. Oh, you're going to say, yeah. The South. 75% of the world's cotton in 1860, 75% of the world's cotton comes from the southern United States. 1860, 3/4 of the world's cotton. So all of these textile factories in the north, they have all these textile factories that are producing cotton, are dependent on cotton. They're dependent on cotton being produced by slaves. Trains that are moving around transporting all these goods that are being produced in places like New York, or new towns that are popping up, like Rochester, Buffalo, Lowell, Massachusetts. A good example of the market revolution is, there's in some instances some women are employed. A lot of immigrants. This is going to create a huge demand for immigration. An important thing to also remember is that all of this centers around like the idea that the fact that these are all textiles. Cotton is really the main crop that fuels production in the north, and cotton is produced by slaves. So there are lots of opportunities for people to work for wages in the north. Immigrant groups, when there's a massive flow of immigrants, new immigrants. America was kind of diverse, but not like it is today. The idea of people coming into America, of getting here, of finding work, of settling down, that whole idea of opportunity really comes from this period. But with it also comes there's a lot of animosity towards immigrants, scapegoating, blaming immigrants for problems that exist in your society. Right? And also seeing cultural differences with those immigrants. They have a different religion, or they speak a different language. And sort of the push and pull where people are drawn to America and there's opportunity here, but at the same time, there are certain elements of American society that lash out at those groups or are not as friendly and welcoming to those groups, right? But you also have, so this is one of the reasons when you have immigrant groups in the 1840s and 1850s, 90% of them end up in the north. right? Of these groups, they end up in northern, what are called northern states or free soil states, right? Because they are willing to work, they're here. Many of them came from very dire situations. In Ireland, there was a potato famine. There were 1 million people that starved to death because of like crop failure issues. And so you have 2 million Irish people over a 20-year period that immigrate here, right? 1 million people from Germany. You have about 70,000 people from China who immigrate, beginning with California. You know, there's a gold rush in California. California becomes a state. And for about a 30-year period, you have just under 100,000 Chinese people who immigrate here. But in 1882, that stops because of the Chinese Exclusion Act. But the government is going to have a hand in all of this, right? Railroad corporations, railroads are the first real powerful corporations in America, and they wouldn't have really have gotten that powerful without the federal government, right? I mean, think about the amount of land that railroads cover. Who's responsible for pushing the borders of America so further than they existed, right? Taking land. I mean, you're talking about and it's not a really pretty story a lot of the time. You're taking land from Indian nations. There's an invasion of Mexico that's going to happen, in which Mexico City is going to be occupied, and it really, I mean, they're basically it's a war, and they surrender and they sign a treaty, and we give them some money for present day like California, Colorado, and Arizona, New Mexico, like a huge landmass. It basically had no choice. Right, there's the army. The U.S. Army is occupying Mexico City. They're kind of like forced at gunpoint to sign a treaty where they lose like a third of their country. You know, so a lot of it's, and then also removing tribes from those places, Indian tribes, and the buffalo population. 30 million American bison in the plains of in the plains area, the middle of this country, are wiped out. You know, after this period, after the Civil War, but sort of to make way to sort of create room where railroads and all these other companies, they're basically given land grants, they're given government contracts to build railroads. So the government has a hand in all of this. The public and private sector are sort of in tandem, right? This is actually a picture, it's a photograph of the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, which it's completed in 1869. The entire Transcontinental Railroad was built by immigrant labor, right? By people coming into this country and working. The Irish built it from the East Coast, and then the Chinese Americans built it from the West Coast. But it's estimated, I mean, the poverty was like 50% of the country, or 40%, up until like 1920. You know, where people, and there's a massive, people are working, like lots of people are working, but, you know, slavery would be, I mean, if you think about slavery, that's a really good example, where everyone's working and everyone's living in poverty, right? Because they're slaves. So everybody, the unemployment rate for slaves was probably close to zero. Right? They were all working, but they were all living in really horrible conditions and living in poverty. So this relates really quick. This is a quote from Henry Clay, who was a senator back then. He runs for president a couple times. He is a Whig. This is one of the political parties I'll talk about later for chapter 10. There's the American system of manufacturing. This is the American system that is basically is a term that applies to the federal government. Promoting infrastructure, promoting business, right? To use the federal government to foster this market revolution and foster growth. Transforming the country has been mainly the work of American legislation, fostering American industry, right? Fostering, like to nurturing American industry, not controlling it, which is something you would see under like a communist government. To coordinate it, rather than without any sort of a federal government looking over, like trying to coordinate, well, what's the best thing for the general good of the country? Well, this company's going to hire more people, and their road's going to connect these two states, so let's give them the money. Rather than a situation where the government's not doing that and people are just sort of scrambling, companies are scrambling and competing with each other, and you know, without any sort of oversight or regulation. Sort of coordinating all the efforts of the private sector to benefit the general good. Theoretically, that's what they're doing. I mean, sometimes it's better than other times. The cotton gin is invented in 1793. The cotton gin is something where you put a bunch of cotton in, and it goes through, and it separates all the seed and all the other stuff out, and you just get pure cotton at the end of it. You would think this would make the job easier. It makes the job of separating cotton easier and faster, which really only means for southern slave owners, plantation owners, they can grow way more cotton. Because now they don't have to rely on slaves sitting there by hand separating all of it. They can just put a bunch of it into a machine, and it's good to go. So they know they can produce so much more cotton each year, which means that they're going to start needing so many more slaves to plant and harvest it, right? So it actually ends up creating a system where there's more slave labor that is brought in, right? There's now, because now instead of 1,000 acres, well, I have this many slaves doing this much work, and it takes this long to separate the cotton, so I can only grow about 1,000 acres, realistically, because there's not enough time to separate all of it. Now there's this machine that'll do it all, that'll separate it for you, so now I'm going to plant 10,000 acres of cotton, but I need that many more slaves. So you end up with a situation where when the cotton gin is invented, there are maybe 750,000 slaves, right, 1793. By 1860, there's 4 million, right? And having to work 14-hour days, 6 days a week or 7 days a week, right? If there was a full moon, some nights they would, when the sun went down, it was bright enough, they would keep working. They would have to keep working.